Okay, so this is hopefully a pretty short video, a really condensed video, which is actually going to be looking at break even. The video itself is quite short. You'll know if you've done business studies with any of your teachers that it's normally done on over several lessons, because it's quite an extensive topic to try and consider and get your head around, and it brings in lots of other aspects of business studies. It's quite an holistic area to look at. And so in terms of what we're looking at here, we've got break even. We're going to try and keep it short, really punchy for anyone who's looking for a short video which is going to help them just get the knowledge that they need to try and get through some of the key elements of the exam. But as I say, break even brings in and incorporates lots of other areas of business studies. So if you have been in any of my lessons, then please use your sheets as well that we've generated within the lessons to try and think about it in its broadest sense. But this is just a really quick video now, just to help anyone, just to try and get that revision started. So this video also is only for those people who are taking the 2018 exam. It's very specific for those people who are taking the GCSE Edexcel business studies this summer. I'm going to skip this and nip on to what the specification tells us. So the specification tells us that you need to be able to draw, interpret break-even chart and calculate the break-even point and the margin of safety. The last two, calculating the break-even point and the margin of safety, have come up in the exam several times. On the right-hand side, it tells us though that you'll not be asked to draw the graph from just a blank piece of paper. If they do ask you to draw a graph, then they would give you the axes on the graph, and then they'd ask you to label and interpret that data. The key bit in order to score well in the break-even chart is being able to consider how changes affect break-even points, and also, more importantly, the advantages and disadvantages of a break-even analysis. Break-even is the level of output at which revenue equals total costs. This is one of the key definitions that you do need to know. Break-even is just when a business is not making a profit and not making a loss. So trying to interpret that and trying to give it this sort of key definition shouldn't be too difficult. As we've used here, we've used the correct business terminology: revenue equals total costs. So just try and think about that equation and then turn that into a lovely sentence, and you've got 2 marks within the exam. The next are key terms which you've got to know in order to know break even. If you don't understand these key terms, then you can't even begin to start break even, and that's why I said that break even is quite a big topic area. It drags in other areas of business in order for you to be able to understand break even. So maybe you want to take a minute just to pause this video. There are 6 questions which could quite easily come up in any exam in the summer. Do you know what these key terms mean? Hopefully you've been able to come up with something like this. I'm not going to read all these out. For the sales revenue, it is perfectly acceptable to write the equation and score 2 marks in the exam, and equally for total cost. You can get away with just writing the equation. You don't need to try and turn that into words. You can just write the equation for both of those, total cost and sales revenue. There shouldn't be anything there, hopefully. The only thing to point out is at the top with fixed cost and variable cost, the EG. You'll get 1 mark for a definition which is not 100% accurate, but if you put EG and provide an example which is accurate, then that can lift a definition up to the full 2 marks. So as you see in the top, I've got fixed costs are costs that do not change no matter how much you produce. Now that would score 2 marks in the exam anyway, but if, for example, you got it a little bit wrong and then you put, for example, rent, then the examiner would be able to say, well, actually, this student, although they've got the word in there a little bit incorrect, they've understood that fixed cost is something that doesn't change no matter how much you produce, in the case of rent, and therefore you should be given 2 marks in the exam. So whenever you've got a definition, try and provide an example. Right, this is just something that you have to know. This is normally worth 3 marks in the exam. Break even equals fixed costs divided by selling price minus variable costs. So in the exam it would be a wordy question. They would give you the selling price, the variable costs and the fixed costs for the business, and they would expect you to work out the number of units. So remember, break even is, a previous example was about hotel rooms, so it's the number of hotel rooms or the number of products made or the number of products that the business is able to produce. So selling price minus variable costs, that's also known as the contribution. because it's the contribution to cover fixed costs. But you'll be given three figures: selling price, variable costs and fixed costs, and you just need to be able to work out break even from that using this formula. Break even chart's going to roughly look a little bit like this. We've got, it's going to look a little bit like this. And what we've got is we have our total, let's start with the fixed cost. Fixed costs are flat, i.e. the line is running straight across. Now, if you understand that fixed costs do not change no matter how many you produce, then you can see on the bottom axis, the x-axis, that as the output goes up, fixed costs just stay the same. And when we're at zero output, fixed costs have a value. In this case, fixed costs are £2,000, because no matter whether you make any or make 3,000, fixed cost will remain the same. Total costs is a combination of fixed costs and variable costs. So in the exam, they might have a variable cost line which starts at zero and runs completely parallel to total costs. I have not put that on my graph because what you're looking out for in the exam is the total costs line, which always starts on the top of fixed costs because it is variable costs plus fixed costs. So the total cost line has to start on the top of the fixed cost line. And again, if you know that definition, that shouldn't be hard to work out in the exam. We've then got our revenue line, which starts at zero, because if you are selling none, you are the revenue is 0 too, and as you sell more, your revenue will go up in a linear fashion. So our revenue line, and it will always be at the top as well. It will be above all the other lines. So it'll be the line that's the highest on the chart once we get to the largest output, and that's the kind of thing that you can look out for. You will see that we have labelled the BEP, the break-even point, which is where revenue and total costs are equal. And this is why understanding those definitions is critical, because if you understand the definition, then you can look and identify on the graph where it's showing you that. So where revenue equals total cost, where they cross over each other on the graph, that's your break-even point. And then above, to the right of the break-even point, we've got profit, and to the left of the break-even point, we've got loss. In order to calculate break-even point, you just draw a little line down and calculate in terms of output, how many products do they have to sell to break even. Margin of safety is how many products more than the break-even point you are currently selling. So the margin of safety, and I've asked you to calculate it before in the exam, is if your break-even point, for example, is 1,000 and your margin of safety, you're currently selling 2,000 products, then it's 2,000, how many you're selling, take away the break-even point, and that will give you your margin of safety. How many products more than the break-even point are you selling currently? That's your margin of safety. It shouldn't be too complicated, but you do need to have a think about really have a think about what the definitions of these key terms are mean in order to be successful in the exam. Our next slide is just straight into the advantages and disadvantages of break-even, or break-even, the analysis. So let's start with our green ones on the left-hand side. So you need to be able to turn these into 3-mark answers, i.e. making your point, and these are points, and then developing them twice in order to create those linking strands which will score in the exam. So if they were to ask you for 2 benefits, then you'd need to be able to turn 2 of these green ones into 2 3-mark paragraphs. So let's have a think about what these mean. So first of all, we've got advantages. You can see how many need to be sold. So if we were doing a break-even chart, once we've done the break-even, if it tells us that our break-even point is 1,000, then a business is able to do some calculations from that. And from that, they're going to be able to maybe go to the bank and say, look, this is the amount of money that we need in order to get the finance to be able to grow the business in the way that we want. So using break-even, once you've worked out how many you've been sold, you could use that potentially to work out whether the product is one that you want to continue with. If the product requires a huge number of products to be sold to break even, then you may consider that it's not worth selling that product. you might, once you've found out how many you can see to be sold, as I say, you could go to the bank or you can try and seek investment, and you can use this data in order to encourage other people to invest in the business, to give you the funding to actually set up and create that product to be able to sell it. So once you know how many you've got to be sold, it's great for trying to gain that investment. Break-even analysis is fantastic for setting targets for sales staff. And think about how this links. You might not have done 3.4 motivation yet, but it links to motivation. Give someone a target, tell them what they need to sell. This will encourage them to hopefully be more motivated in the workplace. This will encourage them to work harder because they know what they're trying to achieve in order to be successful, which means you are more likely to get a higher level of productivity from your staff. What if analysis. So what if analysis, imagine we've done our break-even chart and we've realised we need to sell 1,000 items. And then we have a think about it and we say, well, actually, it's probably not possible to sell 1,000 items. What we can then do is say, well, what if we increase the price of our products? That would change the angle of our revenue line. It would mean we're making more revenue per product, and it would bring the break-even easier, make the break-even at a lower point. So it might bring it from 1,000 to 750. You could also look at trying to reduce your fixed costs, maybe reducing rent, go to a cheaper location. Maybe you could reduce salaries of staff. Anything which reduces costs will make the break-even easier to achieve, will lower that break-even point. And again, with our what if analysis, it might be that you look at trying to change variable costs, which will change the total cost line and again make break-even points easier to achieve. What if analysis is essentially saying, once you've done the break-even, what if we change something in order to make that break-even point easier to achieve? Okay. Disadvantages. Break-even is fantastic if you sell one item at one price. Okay, so when you look back at this chart, maybe if you're not sure what I mean at the minute, go back, have a look at the chart. The break-even point assumes that you sell one product and you sell it for one price. Now, even if you are a business that only sells one product, maybe you're a business that just sells one television, one type of television, the likelihood is that when that television is first brought out, it will be at a higher price potentially. Might be at a premium price because you're the first into the market, and then over time maybe the price will be decreased, particularly as you're looking for extension strategies towards the end of its product life cycle. So most businesses never sell one product and at one price for the entire of its life, and therefore break-even only really works if you are doing one product at one price. Costs may change. Now, variable costs change depending on how many products you produce, and fixed costs, although they do not change depending on how much you produce, they do change. Year to year, maybe, your insurance might go up or your rent might go up. So costs may change. This means that the break-even is no longer valid. How that could affect the business is maybe you've given your sales staff some targets which they can no longer be successful with. If you've told them to achieve 1,000 sales and then they only are able to achieve that 1,000 sales, but actually because costs have increased, you now need to sell 1,250, then you've got a bit of a problem if you've told everyone only to sell 1,000. So break-even assumes that once you've set the break-even chart, that everything stays the same, how much you sell it for and all the costs of the business. And that isn't what happens in the real world. So a break-even is great as an estimate, maybe at the start of a product, being before it's launched or when you're thinking about launching it. But beyond that, the moment that anything financial changes within the organisation to the costs or the revenue, then the break-even point is no longer accurate. And if it's no longer accurate, you can't make good decisions based upon the break-even data. It's only useful if it's combined with market research. If your assumption about how many are going to be sold, once you've done your break even, you're going to make an assumption, can we sell 1,000? If your assumption is based upon poor market research, then your break even will be very, very difficult to achieve. The break even in and of itself tells us what we need to sell. However, we maybe need to go out and make sure that our market research, finding out customer needs is accurate. Or are we producing what the customer even wants? Because if we're not, then we'll never be able to achieve the break even, and it will be nothing more than an academic exercise. Break even is normally only a forecast. You would do it before the product is launched. and therefore it is not an accurate assessment of exactly what needs to be done. And if we link this with the point earlier on, which is that costs may change, or even that you're probably not going to sell for one price for the whole of the product life cycle, then break even is only really good for giving us a very, very rough estimate as to whether this is a viable product or not. And it works for only one product. Most businesses sell multiple products. And as a result, break-even doesn't work for them. Break-even works for whether one product will be successful over its life, and most businesses would either need to produce multiple break-even charts for that product and then have to try and work out how those fixed costs are distributed between those different products, which is very, very difficult to do. So break-even doesn't really work for multiple products in organisations with multiple products. That was hopefully a pretty quick video just to try and get you through some of the basics of break-even. You need to know the key definitions. You need to be able to use the equation and be able to turn these advantages into disadvantages into developed points. If you're in my class and you're having any problems, particularly with the advantages and disadvantages, then do come and speak to me. Okay, make sure you use the notes that you've made in our lessons, and if you are not in any of my classes, then do some research on Tutor to You, BBC Bite Size. There's tons of great resource out there about break even, but make sure you are using it from something from an educational establishment to make sure that you are not finding out information which may not be that useful to you in the exam. Okay, best of luck.